MSW Media.
Spy Talk, a podcast at the intersection of intelligence, foreign policy, national security, and military operations.
Hi there, I'm Jeff Stein.
I'm Michael Isikoff.
And I'm Karen Greenberg.
Welcome to another edition of the Spy Talk podcast. Our special guest today is Tom Blanton. And he's one of those important persons in the Washington national security, foreign policy, and intelligence world that almost nobody outside the city has probably ever heard of, but he's very well known by the powers that be at the CIA. That's because he pries loose their secrets, their family jewels, and of all the work of Tom Blanton and his colleagues at the National Security Archive is entirely legal. They are experts at using the Freedom of Information Act to force the government to release documents that should be made public. Things like CIA assassination plots, a secret CIA LSD and mind control program, spying operations directed at Martin Luther King Jr. and Muhammad Ali, a federal manual for political assassinations. And that's just a hint of the service. Anyway, he'll tell us more. Meanwhile, what's on our mind this week? Well, one of the things that's on my mind is the head of MI6 saying essentially, wake up, everybody, and especially Donald Trump. The Russians are here. They are everywhere, and they are a menace. And we're not sure about where you stand on all this. Another thing is on our mind, of course, is Venezuela. Who knows what the gap, how big the gap is between U.S. intelligence agencies and Donald Trump's thinking. They seem to be on different worlds, on different planets entirely, not just different pages. And finally, the most entertaining thing that's happened this week is Don Bongino, the number 2 FBI official, who should have never been the number 2 FBI official. He's never spent a day working for the FBI before he became the number 2 official. He was a far right conspiracy mongering podcaster. He's out. More chaos at the top of the FBI.
You know, like Bongino, I'm a podcaster. And like Bongino, I've never worked for the FBI. So I'm just wondering, given that there's a vacancy, a deputy director, do I check enough of the boxes?
I think you might apply.
I will consider so. I've got just a couple of quick things that I want to mention because we're having Tom Blanton as our guest, and he runs the National Security Archive, which is dedicated to exposing secrets, right? And transparency. That's its guiding ethos. Now, the Trump administration likes to talk about transparency, right? I mean, in fact, if you listen to the White House press briefings, Levitt, he always talks about this is another example of our transparency. And yet, on Venezuela, or the boat strikes, where's the boat video? Not released.
Well, they show plenty of video of other boat strikes, but not the one on September 2nd.
So transparency doesn't apply to the boat strikes in Venezuela. The OLC opinion that justifies these strikes, where is it? Have we seen it? Transparency doesn't apply to that. The IG report on Signalgate. We were told it's completed. It was raised to the hill. Transparency doesn't apply to that. So when you hear the Trumpers talking about their dedication to transparency because they're releasing 60-year-old JFK documents that have nothing to do with the JFK assassination, we should remember all the things they are refusing to release.
I just have to say one more thing there, which is that this is not new to this administration. It may be supercharged right now and seem like that in this period of time, but the issue of transparency has been with us forever. And in recent presidencies, we've seen a stymied in trying to get so many things, that whether it's about torture or whether it's about drone killings. So I just want to say this may be an escalation, but transparency with the intelligence community has been.
That's certainly true. The only difference is that this White House likes to talk about transparency, and they use it as one of their talking points. right?
Right. What they really mean is we're saying the quiet part out loud in terms of, sort of our mindset about everything. And I think they see that as their transparency about the values that they're apprehending rather than the details of how they're doing it.
Maybe there should be a cryon at the bottom of the screen every time they're on TV saying, "We're lying," but you know that. So. But another hobby horse for you, Mike. Where
one other
is the
point.
White House Situation Room?
Yes. No, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, which is the underground bunker that the president and senior staff are supposed to repair to if there is some threat to the White House. We all saw it at the end of House of Dynamite when people think we're about to be a nuclear war and everybody assembles. And as we have been pointing out for weeks on this, almost every week on this podcast, the underground bunker is located underneath the East Wing of the White House, which has been destroyed. So what has become of the bunker? We got the first glimmer this week. There was a lawsuit brought by the National Historic Trust to block the construction of the new ballroom and reverse what the White House has been doing with the destruction of the East Wing. It's no longer there, so I don't know how they can reverse it. But in the response, the Justice Department said in court filings that they couldn't discuss everything because there were substantial security concerns related to what the plaintiffs in this case were seeking, involving the plan for the East Wing and how it was being reconfigured. This is the first reference, I believe, to the PEOC, the underground bunker. Whether it's still there or not, how one gets there, if it is it being rebuilt? We don't know. Something else they haven't been transparent about, but the first inkling, as we say, that we're on to something here.
Well, Mike, just to follow up on this, do we know where it is and how it's?
We know it's on. Yes, we do. It is underneath the East Wing.
It's still there
of the White House. Well, good question. There's references in the court filings to below grade work that is continuing through September, right? So. And when they discuss that, they talk about security issues. So it seems that they are doing some work now on what was or may still be, we don't know, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center.
And there it is. The story so far. Karen, what's on your mind this week?
I'm really interested in this new woman who's head of MI6. And I think that the speech she gave the other day, which I encourage everybody to read, it's available online, is really in some ways sort of path-breaking in terms of not just what she says, but how she says it and what she emphasizes. So first of all, it takes place, as I understand it, in a dining room, which already sets a different tone in terms of what the atmospherics are going to be. Second thing, I do think this was done in large response to the national security strategy that we talked about last week that came out recently, because it does sort of answer some of the challenges that the Trump administration's national security strategy outlines about Europe. And sort of like Europe not being democratic enough, Europe needing to take on more of its burden, things we've been hearing for a long time. But there was a real anti-Europe strain in it, not emphasizing in the national security strategy what's going on with Russia and the degree to which Russia, what the responses to Russia could be. She nailed that, as you said earlier. But there's a more important thing, which is that she describes us being in a state of in between war and peace. We're in that space, and we need to understand what that space is. And for her, understanding that space is, yes, a lot about technology, which she is an expert on a number of things about the technological advances that have happened over the recent past, especially the last decade. But she talks about the need for human information, the protection of humanity, with all of her scientific background, with all of her understanding, and she makes it very clear of what the threats posed by technology are. She doubles down on this idea of who we are as humans, what we need to understand about ourselves as humans, how we have to use ourselves to be able to get intelligence and to interpret intelligence, and how we really need to take care of one another on this earth. And I just found it a fascinating form of leadership that we really don't hear when you're talking about war and peace.
Yeah, it was a very articulate statement and delivered perfectly in perfect pitch. I must say, the Brits and the Danes famously, are now starting to think of us as an enemy or an adversary. Um, these national security strategy, which really pins no responsibility for the chaos in the world on the Russians and secondarily the Chinese, but it distanced itself from NATO and the EU, and this is what do you call this? I mean, this is earth shattering, you might say. This is a fundamental switch in U.S. strategy and thinking that's dominated the United States and the West since the end of World War II. And I
And
don't
to
think
your
enough.
point, and to your point, it's hurting, as we know, our intelligence relationships around
That's
the
right.
world because of not wanting to be associated with things we're doing that are overstepping, that are violating laws, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. The
Yes. So,
Canadians, for
yep.
example,
Yep.
and some of the allied intelligence services are refusing to
Mhm.
cooperate with us on Venezuela because they think we're committing war crimes and they don't want to be involved with that. Well, enough about all that. Let's get on to Tom Blanton. He's the head of really a unique organization, the National Security Archive, which is not connected to the government at all. It's a private research organization that was started up in the 1980s to be a kind of repository of classified documents that were coming out of the government as a result of the so-called Church Committee hearings in the 1970s, which looked into CIA assassination plots and so on. So it was founded by people like Scott Armstrong, an investigative reporter at the Washington Post, helped along by John Marks, a former State Department intelligence officer who had gotten a hold of lots of documents relating to the CIA's experiments with LSD in a mind control program. And it was off and running, and they thought, well, let's keep on pursuing these secrets, and the public deserves to know. The government can't sit on this stuff forever, so we'll go after them. And it's been going now for 40 some years. Just had their anniversary, and there's a lot to celebrate there. And we thought we'd get in on the party by having Tom Blanton here on the Spy Talk podcast. Let's get to it. Tom Blanton, welcome to Spy Talk. It's great to have you here. In preparation for the podcast today, I was thinking about a biography that Tom Powers wrote of the legendary CIA director Richard Helms. It was called "The Man Who Kept the Secrets." You're the man who gets the secrets and publishes them. Why do you do that?
Oh, one, it's a target-rich environment. Two,
Ah,
those secrets actually belong to us, the public. Three, when the CIA gets to operate in total secrecy, it tends to go off the rails
mm-hmm.
because there's no checks and balances. It's the phenomenon of, compartmented information itself is a violation of the progress of scientific knowledge. If you don't have peer review and nobody can check your footnotes, then you end up invading Iraq looking for weapons of mass destruction. You've been fooled by bad sources and bad intel.
Yeah, you might say the same is going on in regard to Venezuela today. You begin to wonder, why do we have $50 billion a year intelligence community? Because the president doesn't listen to them at all in regard to Venezuela and drug smuggling and so on. So
yeah, that's always been the crux of the matter, I think, for CIA is to try to get the president to listen. I mean, they set up all these levels of deniability. So when they did dark things, the president White House could deny knowledge or agency, and led people like Senator Frank Church in the 70s to write CIA rogue elephant. Well, the documents show the CIA over and over got their go-aheads from presidents of the United States who were always seduced by this idea that you could secretly change the course of events in a foreign country. You look back at the ways we've changed the events in foreign countries, and not many of them are stories you want to tell your kids at bedtime. You
well,
know,
I have to interject here about a little anecdote about the CIA coup in Iran in 1953. I was talking with a CIA officer about it right after the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and he said, drolly, sipping a martini, he said, "Well, we got 25 years out of the Shah. That ain't so bad." So,
yeah,
anyway.
we got one of those great internal CIA histories. We were fighting for it in court, and the CIA kept saying, no, 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 it would damage national security if it got released. And a former CIA officer then leaked the whole thing to the New York Times. So then we could file in court. Well, actually, Your Honor, we can drop our case now because we've got the leaked full copy. And let me tell you, it's the front page of the New York Times. And I don't know, we don't see any damage to national security, Your Honor.
Not yet.
And the judge laughed, actually.
Well, Tom, let's talk about some of your documents, and sort of the foundational one, which is right at the top of the National Security Archive website, is the Family Jewels, the CIA Family Jewels doc, and we have. There was so much in there. I had forgotten. I was reviewing it from this. I mean, on top of, MK Ultra, on top of, LSD experiments, assassination attempts against Castro, I had forgotten. They were surveilling the CIA American journalists.
Yeah.
Former colleague of mine, Michael Gedler at the Washington Post, was placed under surveillance by the CIA. I mean, walk us through the history of the Family Jewels and why it's such a, to this day, astonishing piece of American history.
It's amazing. Putting your fingers on it, Michael. It's just, here you got, imagine a new CIA director. This is Jim Schlesinger in the 1973. He comes in to take over the agency. In his first week in office, front page of the Washington Post, he's got the Watergate burglars got help from the CIA. This is domestic political surveillance and disruption, right? And Schlesinger goes ballistic. And he calls in all the top CIA office heads, division heads, and says, guys, I don't want to find out what's going on in my agency by reading the newspaper. I want you to go task every person who reports to you, send up a memo. What's the worst thing we've done? Where have we broken the law? Where have we broken the charter? Where are we off the rails? And so there was a scurrying around the agency. Now, some of those folks took him really seriously and came in like to the confessional booth at Catholic Church. Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned, and here's what I did, and here's this, assassinations like you're saying. But other people didn't take it seriously. So you've got this huge variation in the memos that are gathered in this notebook called the Family Jewels, about 700 pages of them. A couple of them say, Mr. Director, you should go over to Building C, room 714. There's stuff going on in there that undoubtedly is illegal. And then other memos just say, our office has never engaged in anything illegal. Bye. Right? So you get this huge spread of the amount of accountability. And then, of course, an inside CIA guy who is really upset about being passed over for promotion by the likes of, some of these names, Theodore Shackley, gets really mad and leaks a chunk of the Family Jewels to Cy Hirsch, who puts it on the front page of the New York Times in December of 1974. So it was about a year and a half after the CIA gathered all this. It's out there, right? And the next series of documents we put up there along with the family jewels is all the reaction. It's they're hauling in the next CIA director, briefed the White House. It's Henry Kissinger going crazy. Why is all this stuff coming out? You guys don't know how to keep the secrets, right? I think he's referring to Richard Helms, the man who kept the secrets. They all started gushing out. But I just end this story with the conclusion that our late senior fellow, John Prados, great intelligence historian, came to in his biography of Colby, who's the guy who did fess up and did tell the intelligence committees, who did brief President Ford, who did tell the Justice Department, here's all the wrong things. And Prados concluded that even though his fellow alumni of CIA shunned Colby for the rest of his life, that in fact he probably saved the agency from a total taking apart by Congress, by a charter movement. So Prados says, here's the great irony. Colby, the fess up, the come cleaner, probably kept the agency alive.
Now, how does the National Security Archive come into this? I mean, you were founded 40 years ago. What drove you to start it? Tell us a little about what you do and how you obtained some of these documents.
Well, I'd say real credit to the Freedom of Information Act, which, although it was passed in 66 and went into effect 67, didn't really get to national security documents. The courts even kept Congress people like Patsy Mink had to file a lawsuit and lost in the Supreme Court. Oh no, freedom of information doesn't reach national security. The amendments of 1974 that were passed by Congress over Jerry Ford's veto, right, passed overwhelmingly, first applied freedom of information to the national security agencies. And the golden age of this really was about 1975 to 1981, where piles of documents were being released. The law was being taken seriously. The courts were enforcing it. You didn't have many of these bad decisions later down the pike. And I would say the National Security Archive came into being because stacks of these documents were building up in people's kitchens. And most famously, Scott Armstrong's kitchen, Washington Post reporter. And I joked the other day that it was his wife who really founded the National Security Archive, Barbara Gus. She said, Scott, get those documents out of my kitchen or I'm leaving, right? So Scott came up with this idea to be the institutional memory going forward, filing new requests, indexing and publishing those documents. And that's what we've done for 40 years.
And it's been a brilliant success. Who knew? And what a bright, shining period that was. I can't imagine legislation like that passing today. But
Amen.
let me ask you, as you pointed out, newspapers were publishing CIA secrets
right.
In a torrent during the 1970s. And there's lots of reasons behind that, agency rivalries and self-protective mechanisms and so on. But in any event, was the thinking that you needed to have this private national security archive getting documents and sequestering them because the media wasn't capable of doing that or wasn't consistent in doing that? What's the idea, the guiding philosophy behind the National Security Archive?
I think today it's very much, you're exactly right. Newsrooms and journalists on deadline really can't put the time in. It takes years.
Mm-hmm.
It took us 15 years of pursuing the Freedom of Information action to get those family jewels released. What newsroom is going to put 15 years into an effort like that, bringing in lawyers and the like? And so
very few
institutions like ours are essential for journalism to function, its accountability function on the national security establishment, because we can provide them some of that historical context, the actual documents, who was in the room, who should they go interview, and vice versa. It's those journalists are coming back to us and saying, ooh, we understand there was a decision meeting on, say, Venezuela, and here's who was in the room, and here's who wasn't. And then you can come in through the side windows. So if you know that State Department was in the room, somebody staffed Marco Rubio with a talking points memo and probably a threat assessment and the latest cable from the embassy in Caracas. And that stuff would be in a little briefing package. And the sensitivity of that stuff diminishes over time. I mean, where exactly is in the eye of the beholder. We believe that about 80% of what is classified could probably come out in the next 5 years, 10 years after it was created. There's a handful of real secrets, get somebody killed or cost our country a capability we need for our national security. Bottom line in diplomatic negotiation, design of a warhead, those kind of things that I think most Americans would look at and say, common sense, there are real secrets there. But most of the rest is temporary secrets. But if you don't ask for them and you don't press for them and you don't bring freedom of information laws for them, they'll stay secret indefinitely. That's the default setting.
I like this idea of temporary secrets. um, and I actually think we should do some musing on that. But first, I think I read 60,000 FOIA suits that you guys have filed. Is that correct? I'm
It's actually
wondering.
more like 75,000, but
Wow.
those are targeted requests, not, I'd say, lawsuits. We only sue on a fraction of those because it's a real
Right. Of course.
yeah.
So, but my question is, are there other ways that you get information and documents besides FOIA requests?
Yes, indeed. I was one of my proudest is something that my wife did, Svetlana Savranska, worked in the Gorbachev Foundation archives in the 90s and early 2000s. Gorbachev was really proud of what he had done with the Americans to end the Cold War. He didn't think America won the Cold War. He thought he jointly did. And so he gave Svetlana the transcripts, the Russian verbatim transcripts of his meetings with Reagan and Bush. We brought him back to this country. I'm sitting down at the George H.W. Bush Library at Texas A&M in Texas saying, well, here's the verbatim Russian version of what George said. Where's the American? And it still took 10 years for our declassification system to disgorge, even with us pushing and us having the full Russian version. So Svetlana and I put together the Russian and the American in this big 2 books now. One's called Gorbachev and Reagan, one called Gorbachev and Bush, showing where there were some disagreements in the record, and also showing my fascinating takeaway was that the Russians were way better note takers than we were. And that was especially true for Bush. His top national security assistant, Brent Scowcroft, was a retired general, and he took notes as little bullet points. And then on occasion, the typed up version, the secretary would have typed up illegible. So we went back and looked at his yellow legal pads where he's sitting in the one-on-ones with Gorbachev and Bush, taking the notes. Translator, obviously, it's 3-on-3, translator, note taker, and president. He's taking the notes. And on the yellow pad, you can see his pen just slides off the edge. He fell asleep.
Huh.
Like in a class.
Speaking of communications between an American president and the Russians, are you pursuing any notes that might be available of discussions between Trump and Putin?
Absolutely. And it's going to be hard to get those. This part of the law is really unsettled. I mean, technically, under the law, Trump's first term documents should become available under the Freedom of Information Act. Like we can ask for them, then they still got to go through the reviews and classification and all that stuff. We can ask for them as soon as next year. It's 5 years after he left office the first time. That's what the Presidential Records Act says. But we've never had a situation, well, Grover Cleveland, but there was no Presidential Records Act. We've never had a situation where the past president is the incumbent president. Now, is Trump going to intervene to stop the release of that material? I bet he will. Sure. So it's set up for a real legal battle. I think there are a number of folks out there who have current pending requests at agencies like State Department, which provided interpreters. And remember, he chased Fiona Hill out of the room for a couple of those meetings with Putin. There was just the interpreter in there.
So are there documents that surprised you, where you got stuff you didn't expect to see that challenged prevailing views on a particular issue? What would come to the top of your list?
The fact that the CIA in the 1950s saw assassinations as a modus operandi, as just normal business, that they built into the covert operation plans for Guatemala and for Iran the targeted assassination of people, of key leaders of the opposition, and then even did this internal study. I think it's number 2 on our top 40 list of amazing documents of how to kill people. I mean, just this is an instruction manual. It says, look, it says something like, the simplest local tools are often the most efficient means of assassination. A hammer, axe, wrench, screwdriver.
What's the context for that?
This is a 1954 study of assassinations. They're building in a target list of Guatemalans that they're going to take out as part of the coup against the Arbenz government in Guatemala. And they're just walking through it. And there's these amazing quotes in here. It says, assassinations is dubious morally, so the morally squeamish should not attempt it. Well, that's an interesting way to put it. So,
Can I ask a question about right now? Are you worried about documents not existing? For example, you're referring to Fiona Hill not being in the room. I mean, who takes the notes? And you know that there have been a number of meetings, as reported, that notes aren't taken.
Right.
We know of other times when we've been told that Trump will just walk out of the room with a consequential document. Are you worried that the documents you traditionally and collect won't exist? And then what's the what's the plan?
That's a great question, but I think historians and journalists have been dealing with this ever since the invention of the telephone. Because once the telephone came in, suddenly those incredibly eloquent, long diplomatic messages summarizing meetings with heads of state turned into quickie phone calls briefing higher ups. So you have this gap, it's the telephone gap, where paper that had been created earlier by operatives in intelligence or diplomacy or defense no longer is missing. I would say the electronic means, the digital means, are filling in that gap in a huge way. For example, we don't have Nixon tapes anymore. Once the Supreme Court ruled that a president couldn't hold his tapes forever, right? No president since then has taped their meetings and phone calls. In one way to look at it is, what a loss for history, what a loss for accountability. And yet, what we see in the replacements for that is, Henry Kissinger coming out of meetings with Nixon or with Ford and telling his aides, do this, do that, do that. In the modern age, it's Tony Lake used to brag he would go in to brief Bill Clinton just with an index card. And he said to me personally, he said, Tom, you're never going to have transcripts of the president talking with his national security advisor the way you had for Nixon. And because it's just that index card. And then his deputy, a wonderful woman named Nancy Soderberg, who went on to be ambassador to the United Nations. Nancy said, oh, Tony, when you come out of the Oval, you stand next to me at the computer and you dictate all these emails that go out to this agency, that agency, and another agency. And by the end of the day, all those folks have replied, and there'll be strings of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of e-documents and emails, and now text messages and WhatsApp messages that are.
So you're not worried about documents being destroyed? You think you can find that information elsewhere, like we've seen, just to pick one, with the USAID documents? I mean, you're not worried about this in terms of what you do, what your profession is?
The National Security Archives, we've, over our years, brought lawsuits to stop that kind of destruction. We brought the lawsuit that saved the White House email backup tapes when they were trying to destroy them, covering up all the 1980s, right? We brought lawsuits against every president, including Obama and Biden and Trump and W. Bush, to make sure the e-records are saved. Our lawsuit against Trump 1 forced them to digitally archive Jared Kushner's WhatsApp messages because it was pretty clear that's how they were really doing deployment.
But Tom, they are
It's gonna take us years
blatantly
to get them. Right?
But they are blatantly disregarding the retention of e-records. Look at the whole Signal chat with Hegseth when they're planning. They're doing it on Signal. That's not retrievable. Those messages go away after time. You can't get them. And we've had time and time again. I mean, go back to Hillary Clinton. She's using a personal email, so she doesn't have to use State Department emails that are FOIAble, that you and others can get. She doesn't want. So, I mean, we've had blatant disregard.
I think most blatantly were the pictures Maggie Haberman has published of the ripped up Trump documents in the toilet, 2 toilets, right? But just take the Hillary example. If she hadn't used that private server, the State Department didn't have the capacity to digitally archive her email messages. There are 30,000 messages she did turn over that we wouldn't have had because of the incapacity inside government to do it. John Kerry was the first Secretary of State to have all of his email automatically archived, which was a standard we got applied to the White House in the 1990s. And it took to 2014 to get it applied to the State Department.
But what do you do about Signal and WhatsApp?
Well, with WhatsApp, there is a digital tool that the corporation had to develop because of insistence by their finance clients, because banks have a much tougher time. They got to verify financial transactions against fraud. And so there's now digital tools that the National Archives can use, that records managers inside the White House are now routinely applying. So I think our problem down the road is we're going to be missing some key items, whatever Trump tore up and put in the toilet, or the notes from 2 of those summits with Putin. But we're going to have this huge amount of electronic records that's going to be a bigger challenge, which is how do you use algorithms? How do you use AI? How do you search through them and figure out how to triangulate those against each other? What's really closest to the truth? I think our problem is going to be the overwhelming mass and volume of electronic records left behind. There is a problem of some people, Hegseth at the top of the list with his Signal chat, trying to avoid accountability in the here and now by using disappearing apps. No question. Steve Bannon, past master, his first 6 months in Trump 1 was all disappearing Signal chats. And we don't have any of that. So Bannon with the embeds. So you got to go back. Y'all are some of the greatest journalists and researchers I've ever met. You got to go back and you can fill in those gaps. Who was he talking to? What kind of record did they keep? What kind of diary? I mean, at the end of every interview I ever do with a former national security official, after we've gone through all the substance, I end with a, hey, you didn't happen to take a diary home, did you? Or what about, there was one former ambassador, I'll leave him unnamed, who actually cut the top secret line off the top and off the bottom, but kept a complete set of his top secret cables because he wanted to know for his memoirs, right? So we're filling in the gaps, but you're right. It's a struggle when you got people like that who are trying to avoid that accountability.
Speaking of filling in the gaps, are you guys still working on stuff related to the Senate torture report?
Absolutely. That's
how's that
document
going?
number 4 on our top 40.
I know.
Right. Where, this is one of those classic examples of how hard it is, but how useful it is to pursue a Freedom of Information request over time. So the Senate Intelligence Committee staff, Dan Jones, immortalized by Adam Driver in the movie, made a real point of doing footnotes, right? And in the footnotes, they listed the cable numbers of 12 cables that came back from the black site in Thailand to Washington about one particular captive, this guy Nashiri, who had been part of the blow up of the USS Cole, et cetera, et cetera. But the footnotes didn't just had the cable numbers, right? So then Gina Haspel, who was the base chief we know at that time,
former CIA director, Gina, or CIA director to be.
And interesting, journalists then say, oh, Gina Haspel, she was the head of that black site where they waterboarded Zubaida. And everybody knows waterboarding's a war crime, all that kind of stuff. And to push back and to get her confirmed, the CIA actually released something they hadn't released, let the Senate release, which is the date that she arrived in Thailand, right? She wasn't there for Zubaida in the summer of 2002. She only came in the fall, just in time for Nashiri, right? And so then we know from CIA Inspector General's report and from the lawsuits brought by survivors of particular days. What was day 1? That if you click on the document, this cable looks like Swiss cheese. The date and the time are redacted by the CIA as a national security secret. But the text says this was day 1 of Nashiri's interrogation. Boom. We can then put the date in there from the IG report. We can then put Gina Haspel in there as the base commander because the CIA confirmed that for confirmation. And suddenly, and then from the lawsuits, we can put in, here's the CIA contractors, Mitchell and Jessen, who were running an $80 million business, had never done interrogations, didn't know Arabic, and made up this whole learned helplessness idea for prisoners. Karen, you know about this. You published whole
Yeah, I
books
do.
on this topic. But suddenly, with those external pieces of information, we're doing what good historians and good journalists do. We fill in the Swiss cheese. We can put her there. Here's the cable. Here's what they did in the Sherry. Here's who's in charge. And suddenly you get the story. And it's an amazing, but it takes a lot of work.
So, speaking of filling in the Swiss cheese, I was at your great celebration last week for your 40th anniversary. Amazing crowd. And one of the people I spent some time talking to was Cy Hirsch, the legendary investigative reporter who actually sort of broke the story of the family jewels, as you mentioned, for the New York Times, 74, 75. And we were talking about all the stuff that has come out related to the JFK records and, what he made of them. And he said something that really interested me. He said, the full story, and he's not a Kennedy conspiracy theorist. He doesn't believe that, but he does believe there's more to be learned about what the CIA was up to in its efforts to get rid of Castro. And he said the full story will not be told until the Kennedy Library releases its Operation Mongoose documents. And he said they've got a whole series of docs that have never been released. And that kind of surprised me. Like the Kennedy Library, I thought the library system is all under the National Archives. How is it that there might still be mongoose documents at the Kennedy Library that we have never seen? And is that on your list to try to get?
Yep. Our dear colleague Peter Kornblue has been chasing those for 20 years because the problem there is a number of the collections at the Kennedy Library were donated by individuals, and they weren't official government records at the time. And so I believe what Cy is referring to are the Bobby Kennedy.
Right. Yeah, he did say these are Bobby Kennedy's role in overseeing Operation Mongoose, which was the post Bay of Pigs operation to get rid of
assassination attempts and everything else. There's this amazing pair of documents that Peter has published on the day we find out about the missiles in Cuba on October 14th of 1962. We find out from the overhead photography the Soviets have put missiles there that can hit the continental United States. And so the White House and the executive committee are going into high alarm. That same day, Bobby Kennedy hosts a meeting of the Mongoose team, and they decide to up their pace of internal sabotage and assassination in Cuba. I mean, was there not an adult in the room saying, wait a second, guys, you got nukes in Cuba that invade the homeland, and you're going to up the speed of the pace of these? And most of those ops were, ultimately futile. Totally futile. I'll tell you one story, which because of the documents we'd gotten loose on the Bay of Pigs, including the recruitment and all that, we went and interviewed the key guy, Robert Reynolds, who had recruited the Bay of Pigs invaders. And then we went and interviewed the chief of staff of Mongoose, a guy named Sam Halpern. We said to both of them, why don't you come to Cuba with us? We're going to have this big critical oral history conference with Fidel Castro. And he's willing to have some of the invaders come from Miami. And he's willing to have you guys come. And they looked at us like, are you nuts? I said, look, we took McNamara to Cuba in 92 and Dick Goodwin and Arthur Schlesinger. You guys can come. And so the Cubans looked at these retired CIA hands who run all these assassination plots. I think they probably vetted them through their own systems, had them come down to the Palace of the Revolution. We have this big conference looking at the Bay of Pigs. The last day, we actually walked on the beach of the Bay of Pigs. Fascinating. People who sat on opposite sides shooting at each other or walking kind of arm in arm, Cubans, right? But the most amazing moment was Fidel asked the CIA guys to lunch. So in an upper room of the Palace of the President, you've got Robert Reynolds and Sam Halpern sitting at one end of the table, me and Peter Kornblue and our scholars on this side, Fidel and I think between Fidel and the CIA guys were his interior ministry folks, just in case there was some plastic explosive or something, who knows, right? And And I turn and I say, Robert Reynolds, why don't you tell the Comandante en Jefe like how you had his picture on your desk cubicle at the CIA in 1958 and 59. And why was that? And Reynolds kind of very abashed looks up and he says, well, in the CIA, we understood the Batista dictatorship was corrupt and on its way out. And we were sort of cheering for you and the revolutionaries, the modernizers. And I said, and he sort of stops there. And I said, but Robert Reynolds, tell the Comandante why you took it down. And Reynolds said, well, after you started lining up people against the wall of the castle in Havana and shooting them without really any due process, yeah.
How did Castro take that?
The bloom was off the rose.
Really interesting. He said, well, you're probably right. He said there was so much pressure built up. We never killed prisoners. The whole course of the revolution, our secret sauce was that they knew if they just lay down their guns, gave us their guns and their boots, we wouldn't shoot them. And so Batista's troops would just surrender en masse to much smaller groups of our revolutionaries. We never shot them. But what that meant was we were letting loose rapists and murderers who had killed people in our families. And so, but when we won, the pressure for revenge was so great. That's what that.
Sounds like Castro has something in common with Donald Trump, but
there you go.
The urge for retribution.
We have to kind of wrap this up now, but I was wondering if there's any other white whale you're chasing that you've been chasing for years and you're determined to get to the bottom of what tranche of secrets is left to penetrate.
Oh my goodness. Jeff, as you know better than I do, there's these huge establishments that are holding more secrets than the rest of the world put together. The nuclear weapons establishment in the United States and the intelligence community. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was a Harvard scholar years ago who compared the amount of open source material coming into the Library of Congress or to Harvard Library with the amount being created under the classification rules as classified and going into the secret vaults. And he said the ratio is like 10-1 secret to open, right? That is enormous. That's bigger than Moby Dick in terms of a whale to publish. The point of the National Security Archive is to keep up a constant pressure on that reflexive bureaucratic tendency to create and keep secret forever. And it's a lot of work.
So just to bring it up to yesterday, Jack Smith testimony behind closed doors, I think they didn't discuss the second part of his report on the mishandling of documents. Is that something that is on your list of things you're trying to find out about?
Absolutely. Imagine getting a court order to review the boxes that Trump stole and put under that chandelier in the bathroom behind a shower curtain, which is one of my favorite pictures of a classified information environment ever, and just get a rolling review of what was there. We could even exempt the 100 some odd items that the FBI said were top secret or really would damage national security. But what else was in those 30 something boxes? What did it take? What did this guy, noted narcissist, what did he think was really important from his entire first term that he would stick it up in the White House residence and then haul it down to Mar-a-Lago? I don't know. I think the American people would learn something about.
What's the prospect of getting those?
It's an open legal question. It's sort of what we started with. Presidential Records Act. Nobody's ever dealt with a situation like this before. But I think there's a bunch of folks out there going to be bringing some legal action to see if we can get some review. And by staying away from the 100 some odd classified items, we might actually get a review. And it's worth doing for history and for now.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Tom, thanks so much for spending the time with us on the Spy Talk podcast. You are a national asset, I might say.
Bless your heart, Jeff.
Carrying the load for the rest of us.
An intelligence asset.
Maybe not that.
How about a historian's dream?
No, I'm with you, Karen.
Well, I think we all could say, keep on keeping on, brother.
Thank you very much. Y'all keep up the great work.
For another 40 years.
Amen.
And that's it for this week's Spy Talk. Be sure to check out our complete podcast archive on Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you haven't already, do check out the spytalk.co news site on Substack, where we offer a steady diet of scoops and original analyses from the intersection of intelligence, foreign policy, and military operations. Just Google Spy Talk, and you'll quickly find your way there. This edition of the Spy Talk podcast was smoothly produced, as always, by Kanai and expertly edited by Molly Hawkey for MSW Media. That's it. See you around. I'm Jeff Stein.
I'm Michael Isikoff.
I'm Karen Greenberg.
Thanks for listening.
For more original reporting and insights like this, subscribe to spytalk.co on Substack and follow us on Twitter at @talk_spy. If you enjoyed our podcast, subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
MSW Media.